Hello and welcome to the second video of the series. My name is WIM Jessie February, and today we will be talking about knight and pawn endgames as well as knight endgames. The first endgame we will be taking a look at together is the one in front of you. The sad thing is, usually when you just have a lone minor piece, meaning a knight on the board versus a king or bishop versus a king, you find that it is impossible to checkmate your opponent. But on rare occasions, such as this one, it is indeed possible. So why don't you take a look at the position? You can even pause the video at this point and try to figure out how it is a win for white. So let's take a look at the solution. Over here, there are a number of variations that we will go over just to show you what can happen in just about every scenario. So the first move white will make is knight f6. And if the king goes to h1, the knight will go to g4. Maybe black here. Okay, it's forced maybe either g5 or h2. So g5, king f1, right? Then h2 is forced, and knight f2, checkmate. But even with black to move here, white is still winning. It just takes a little bit longer. So let's take a look. King h1, knight f6, king h2, knight g4 check, king h1, king f1, g5, king f2, h2. And now you must be careful as to not play king f1, because that would be stalemate and white would not win the game. Here the knight needs to go to e3, g4, knight f1, g3, and knight takes g3, checkmate. If you can recall, in the previous video we spoke about a concept called triangulation. And in that particular instance, we try to maneuver a king whereby we arrive at the same position, only giving the move to our opponent. Unfortunately, the case is not the same when it comes to a knight. So knights cannot triangulate, unfortunately. So in this position, it is black to move, and black has to be very careful. So I will give you a moment to take a look at this position and find a move for black. One hint I can give you is that we are going to try and restrict white's king from moving. Alright, I hope you found the move king f7. And after knight c7, king f8, knight e6, king f7, and it is a draw. No matter where the knight ends up going, the king will just alternate between f7 and f8, achieving the draw, since the white king cannot move from h8. So in front of you, you will see the pawn on h2, the knight on g4, the king on g7, and the white king is guarding that square on h1 quite closely. Now, unfortunately, no matter how far the king is away from the pawn, even after being able to reach the h3 square, there is no way in which black can win the game. So let's take a look at what can happen here. King h6, king h1, king h5, king g2, king h4, king h1. If we move the knight, we lose the pawn. If we move the king, it's stalemate. Since the only escape square for the white king is g2, there is no way to be able to drive away the king from these light squares. If we try to use the knight, we lose the pawn. And unfortunately, king versus lone knight cannot be checkmated. So in this instance, it is a draw. So here is a puzzle for you to try white to move in this position. So I'll give you a moment to try and solve it, then we will come back and do it together. So the solution is king to f3. after which black plays king h1. If, of course, black plays h2, what does white play? Indeed, knight g3, checkmate. So here, after king f2, black goes king h2, knight d4, king h2, knight f5. Again, if they push the pawn, we have knight g3, checkmate. King h2. Can we play knight g3? No, knight g3 is a complete draw. So here we have to play knight e3, king h1, knight to f1, and now the king can no longer move, h2, and knight g3, checkmate. The best way for a knight to defend a pawn that is a bit far from the king is from the back. As you can see, the b pawn is traveling all the way up the board to the 8th rank, and at the moment the knight is in front of the pawn. However, if the knight is behind the pawn on a1, c1, or d2, the king will no longer be able to chase the pawn or the knight. After the king decides to capture the knight, the pawn will not be able to be stopped. Let's take a look. For instance, after knight c4, king b4, knight d2, king c3. Now the white king has the opportunity to move towards the pawn. If the king decides to capture the knight, the pawn simply runs up the board and cannot be stopped by the king. Becomes a queen. Let's just place a queen there and becomes a queen. On the other hand, it is very easy to protect the pawn at c4 even if it is being blockaded by another pawn. So for instance, here white has two choices. White can either play knight b5 or knight d5. So let's take a look at knight b5 here, king e4, king g2, king d3, and what does white play here? Yes, knight to d6, and it becomes very difficult for black to find a way out. Alternatively, knight d5, king d4, and knight b6, protecting the pawn at c4 and allowing time for the white king to catch up and eventually capture the pawn at c5. The following game that we will be looking at was actually taken from a recent club tournament played on chess.com, the PE Chess Club Blitz. It took place on the 19th of April, and it was between two players with the username of Stevie1029 and Izzy10. So we're going to go through the opening, the middle game quite quickly, and then arrive at the end game, where I had seen some very nice knight play. It was definitely a nightmare. Okay, so here we have e4, g6, knight f3, bishop g7, bishop c4, d6, knight c3, knight f6, castle. Alright, some attacking play there. Knight back, a6, d3, castling, knight g4, bishop f4, e5, bishop d2, b5, bishop b3, some normal exchanges happening, maneuvering of pieces, getting d4 in. It's quite nice. I see double pawns in the center. Alright, and after solidifying these double pawns with a move like e5, it maybe created a weakness or two on d5, etc. on the light squares. Exchanging of rooks. And we have arrived at the knight ending. So here in this position, it is black to move, and of course the weaknesses that black will be focusing on are the pawns that cannot be protected by other pawns, either isolated doubled or backward in this case. The black knight is of course more centralized than the white knight, but let's see how the game progressed. So I have king f7, knight g3. My question is, where's the knight headed? Possibly there are some ideas. Of course it cannot go here, and protecting a pawn, there's of course better use for the knight than protecting a pawn at this stage. And if it's possible to exchange one of the weak pawns for a connected pawn, that would definitely be white's idea here. Already I'm looking at moves like knight e2, knight c3, knight d5, knight c7 attacking the pawn. Of course over here we're assuming that black will also move their knight to try and attack our pawns. So let's see what happened here. King f6, king g1, perhaps trying to centralize the king, because in the endgame the king becomes a very active piece, and we know this. The king belongs in the center in the endgame. Knight c7, possibly trying to play d5, which is an interesting take here. I personally would have preferred the knight to go to g5, or perhaps a different route to try and take advantage of the weaknesses, although this is also a good attempt. King f2, d5, capturing. And now there's something I would definitely start worrying about, and that is knight c3, knight b1. This capture has definitely benefited black more than it has white pieces. As white, it was probably not the best idea to capture, and rather allow black to capture on e4, capturing back with a knight, left with a central knight in the meantime, trying to get the king more towards the center, of course. And even if black advances the pawn on d4, you could capture back, and becomes a weak pawn on d4 for white to target later. Capturing, king f3, and already we can see that black is aiming at the a3 pawn. And we know nothing is more dangerous than a passed pawn that is on the side of the board, especially one that is going to run really fast and might even win the game. Closing the center off was maybe not the best idea. Pause the video and tell me, what do you think the best move here in this position is? I agree, maybe knight e4 was a good attempt. Knight e4 check, with the idea of after knight takes, the king is centralized. And now it's simply a matter of waiting. And this is a complete draw in my eyes. Alright, so e4 was probably a mistake here. Best was to exchange knights, because the black knight is definitely stronger than the white knight right now. A complete nightmare for white. Knight d5, finally centralizing the white knight. King f7, but maybe it's a little bit too late. Alright, this was also a dangerous attempt, since you would be leaving the b4 pawn unprotected, as well as after the b4 pawn is captured is protecting a6, which is probably something that white missed here. Knight c7, knight takes, and suddenly there are two passed pawns on the queen side, which might be a little bit too much if white still hopes for a draw or win in this position. And now exchanging knights is definitely not something I recommend. When you are down in material, you want to exchange pawns and not pieces. When you're up in material, you want to exchange pieces and not pawns. And what do I mean by pieces? Minor pieces or major pieces, being your knights and bishops, minor, or your rooks and queens, major. And when you are down in material, you want to exchange pawns, because as we have established, lone minor pieces cannot win a game. You cannot corner the king with one bishop or one knight on the board. And of course here, black went on to win a very beautiful game. Well played to both. There is a very popular theme in Knight Endgames called the deflecting knight sacrifice. It is seen in a lot of endgame positions in some or other fashion. So take a moment in this position and try to find the best move for white. So the best move here is, of course, you must have guessed it, knight to d4 check, which is distracting the e6 knight. Of course, taking is forced, otherwise white will simply take black's knight and will be a knight and a pawn up, more than enough to queen the pawn. The black king on b5 is too far away from h8 to stop the pawn. So let's go back. Knight to d4, knight takes d4. Now what is the move? Yes, king to f6. It stops the knight from going back to these squares. If in this position you wanted to push the pawn, it would not end well with the idea of knight to e6, h6, knight check. If the king goes to g7, knight just comes back. If the king goes to f6, knight goes to f8, and there is no way around it. That's why in this position, the move is king f6, shoulders the knight cannot enter any of these squares, and the pawn will be able to queen safely. And now, there is something very important that we will be taking a look at, and it is called Botvinnik's formula. No, not the secret formula to the Krabby Patty recipe that Plankton has been trying to get his hands on, but of course this is not a secret formula, but a very well-known formula that Botvinnik had formed. And of course he had claimed that all knight endgames are pawn endgames, which basically means that all principles of pawn endings also apply to the endings of knights. So let's start off this formula with our first classical endgame. So in this diagram, we see that black has an outside passed pawn, which in any other case, if the knights were not to exist at this point, it would be a clear win for black. But since there are knights on the board, black's job becomes a little bit more difficult. So every move has to be precise and perfect. King to f6. So pause the video, take a look. It is black to move. What would you play here? And just to note, this game was played between Lasker and Nimzowitsch in Zurich, 1934. So the solution is king to f6, knight to h7, king g7, knight g5, king f6, knight h7, and this does not mean that black wants a draw. Sometimes in chess it is required to use the concept of do not hurry. Players usually do this to either gain time on the clock, or from a psychological standpoint, it could have just been a small tease. And here black finally plays king to e7. So it looks like the king has backed away, but that's not going to last for long. The king has just evacuated the very important square for the knight. A centralized knight controls up to 8 squares. Here white plays knight g5, knight e5 finally, and king d4. Black protects the knight with king d6, also attaining opposition as discussed in the previous video. You'll see a lot of similarities in concepts: opposition, centralizing the king, and now I finally understand why Botvinnik believed that pawn endings and knight endings are essentially the same. Here white plays knight h3, a4, knight f4, h4, knight h3, and of course the very slow and do not hurry move, b6. Knight a4, just back and forth, trying to prevent the pawn from going to h3. b5, once again, do not hurry. And knight h3 was definitely a move frowned upon here. Reason being, the knight should not have left f4. Here it stops the king from going to e6 and definitely controls one of the central squares, just trying to prevent both the pawn from moving and the king from getting closer. The best defense that was suggested here was of course king c3. So after knight h3, black plays knight c6 check. King to e3, and now black no longer has to worry about the outside passed pawn. And here black simply plays king c5, which is a diagonal opposition over here, and also threatening to go ahead and capture the pawn on b2 and later on a3. White plays king d3. What do you think black pieces did here next? Yes, b4 takes, and here king takes b4. King goes to c2 and knight d4 check. And here we see Nimzovich's technique with no hurry, of course, and how he ended this beautiful game. King b1, knight e6, king a2, king c4, king a3, king d4, king takes a4, king takes e4, 4, king f3, b5, king g2, and in this position white resigns. Bravo. And so before I end off this video, I have a challenge for you. So the board looks a bit funny right now because there are only 8 queens on the board, but that's all you need in order to complete the challenge. You will take 8 queens if you have 8 queens, otherwise you can use 8 pawns and pretend they are queens. The task is to place each queen on the board, but the trick is they cannot attack each other. And yes, it is possible. Don't cheat, try to do it on your own and see how long it takes you. Please add a comment below, and if you do not want any spoilers, guys, then please don't check out the comments. Perhaps someone had already put the answer there. If you're ready to check your answer with someone else, go ahead and check out the comments. I'm really excited to see what you guys come up with, and I promise you it is possible. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe to the club channel. See you next time. Bye bye.